Hello. Over the last couple of videos, we have set up entities in FusionAuth. We have set up APIs and shown how you can have different APIs within your own system authenticate against FusionAuth via the client credentials grant. We've also shown how you can extend this permission system to outside entities, such as companies, for which you may want to bill access to your APIs. I'm going to show you one final feature, which is the client credentials grant Lambda. What this lets you do is modify the JSON Web Token created by the client credentials grant, and you can do so in pretty flexible ways. So let's go ahead and jump into that. The first thing we're going to do is actually add some custom data to one of the companies. So the premise here is that, if you'll recall, we had different permissions that were granted to the Reminders API for each company. Pied Piper has access to the Reminders API, and Hooli does not. See, the Reminders API, Pied Piper has a read permission. Hooli has no permissions against any entities in our system. But what if we want to put a special attribute on one of these companies? Perhaps it's for a trial period, perhaps it's for a limited duration license, and we want to allow them to have write access to the Reminder API. We can do this by using the Lambda. So what we're going to do is actually update the Pied Piper entity to mark them as a premium account. And then we will create a Lambda and assign it to our tenant to be executed. We will see that if a company has a premium account, they will get enhanced access to our Reminder API. So the first thing we have to do is actually add this premium account attribute to the Pied Piper entity. And we can do that using the FusionAuth API. Before, we don't see any data. So you can see that we have added this attribute. And it shows up here. Now, this is a JSON object, and you could put whatever you want into this data field. So it can be simple values like what we just did here. It could also be long, complicated nested objects or arrays, and you can update that whenever you want, and then it is available inside your Lambda for you to pull from. Let's go ahead and look at that Lambda. So we're creating a new Lambda. And it has to be of type client credentials, JWT populate. And so this is the code that gets executed. It receives one argument that is mutable, that it can change, and 3 immutable arguments. So it receives the recipient entity, which is the client of the client credentials grant. So in this case, it might be Pied Piper or Hooli. It receives the target entities. So that could be one entity, an API, the Reminder API, or multiple different entities. and then it receives the permissions. And you can look at those immutable entities and make changes to the JSON Web Token. So in this case, on line 3, we are looking to see if the recipient has a data field of premium account, and if that premium account data field evaluates to true, then we are going to do a couple of things. On line 4, we're going to set the claim of premium account to true. That could be used downstream by other applications. We also, on lines 5 through 8, are actually going to modify our permissions, and we're going to, for a given target, we're going to automatically push the write permission onto the array of permissions that are available for this client, for the recipient entity. So this basically says if a recipient entity comes in requesting permissions and they have the field premium account set to true, we're going to add a write permission to that token. And this happens before the token is signed. So this obviously gives you a large amount of flexibility. You could take actions based on time. You could take action based on the target entities, the recipient entities, the various permissions. And you can also manage this via the API. So you could have this live in a version control system, which I would suggest, and update FusionAuth whenever there are changes to the Lambda. Now the last thing we need to do is actually set up the tenant to execute this Lambda when a client credentials grant comes in. So we navigate to the tenant, and then we navigate to the OAuth tab, and then you can change the client credentials population Lambda. And this also can be managed via the API. So we're saving that off. Now I'm going to show you the same request for the reminder API that we saw in a previous video, but now it's going to include those extra claims. We need to make sure to be using PyPiper. And you can see that the scope doesn't change. On line 14, we're still requesting the scope of read. So let's go ahead and look at the payload. So you can see that, let's put that through JQ. So you can see that we have the extra claim, we have the extra permission, and all this happened with a couple of configuration changes on our part. One situation where you might want to use this would be if you had a bunch of clients and you didn't want to go through and manually update each of their grants, or you needed to change the grants only for a certain period of time. You can apply a Lambda, and then later you could change the code of the Lambda and have the permissions essentially be revoked without going through and manually scripting each of the grants. So that concludes this series on using the client credentials grant and entity management within FusionAuth. Thank you for your time.